Your Excellency, Madam Consul General, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to this event. And I'd like to thank Dr. Jablonski for inviting me to participate in and for the Oskar Halecki Institute of organizing this event. And I'd also like to thank Bożena Zarafin, who is our PowerPoint queen, who helped with the production of this PowerPoint deck. In 1959, KGB Chief Shalepin provided Khrushchev with a memo in which he indicated that in April and May of 1940, 21,857 Poles were murdered. And what I'm going to do now is provide you a story of one of the Poles, my grandfather Stanisław Kawczak. And afterwards, we'll show a short video that I found recently on YouTube that was made in Poland about my grandfather. So my grandfather Stanisław Kawczak was a Polish patriot, a lawyer, an author, an officer in both World War I and World War II, and a Katyn Massacre victim. He was born in 1892 in the town of Zwardan, a small town near the southern border. It's in Galicia, and at the time, of course, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father, my great-grandfather, was a railway engineer, and before World War I, he moved the family, 6 children, to Nowy Sącz. My grandfather finished high school in Nowy Sącz in 1911, and then attended Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he studied law. He was conscripted into the Austrian army in 1913, and he returned to the study of law at Jagiellonian University after the war and obtained a doctorate. So, during the war, I'll say a few things here about his experience based on his memoirs, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But in 1936, he wrote his memoirs about the war. And I found this story fascinating because most Western history books, the English and the French ones about the war, talk about the Western Front, right? So it's all about the battles of Ypres, the Somme. For the French, it's Verdun. And when it comes to the Eastern Front, it's generally speaking restricted to Hindenburg and Ludendorff beating the Russians at Tannenberg. Not very much is known about the Battle of Galicia, but in fact, at the beginning of the war, it's one of the great battles, besides Tannenberg and the Battle of the Marne, which put an end to the German Schlieffenplan. And my grandfather began his memoirs writing about that first year of the war in the Battle of Galicia, and it's a tremendous story, very vivid account of a soldier with endless marching, punctuated by battles. And they range the full gamut, from bombardment, artillery shells, the machine guns, and then cavalry charges. They still had those. And then fighting with bayonets. And then from 1915, the Italians joined the Entente forces, and the Austrians sent my grandfather's regiment to fight at the Battle of the Isonzo. So this is another battle that, generally speaking, in the Western books doesn't get a lot of airtime or pages in the history books, but between the Italians and the Austrians, of course, is the Alps. It's very difficult to fight in the Alps. But in the northeast corner of Italy, along the Isonzo River, there's some plains. So the idea for the Italians was to break through to the Slovenian plateau and capture the capital of Slovenia and then Vienna. And of course, for the Austrians, it was the opposite. Instead, what happened was very much something similar to the Western front and the trenches there, where the frontier, the battleground was basically static And over 2 years, there were a series of 12 consecutive battles. So my grandfathers wrote that when the Poles were actually sent to fight the Italians, they had nothing against the Italians. In fact, they wanted the Italians to win. And so the thing is that he calibrated the machine gun sights in such a way as to deliberately miss their targets. And he tells a number of fascinating stories about, for example, one day the Germans provided advance information to the Austrians to indicate that they were going to send at 9 o'clock at night a series of planes over the frontier to go and do some bombing in Italy. And so what he tells in the story is that 15 minutes before the Germans were to arrive, the Poles immediately started a firefight with the Italians to wake them up so that they would be ready. And when the planes came and made their noise, of course, the searchlights were turned on. And not only the Italians were fighting or shooting at the German planes, but so were the Poles. And he actually says that the Polish officers wanted to defect and cross the river and join the Italians. But it was very difficult. At one point, they had a number of Russian prisoners who were brought to the Austrian trenches to build the trenches and the bunkers and so on. And 2 of them managed to escape. But while they were swimming across the Po River, they were shot by the Italians. So for the Poles, what they tried to do is send empty missiles that contained a flag with a message inside saying, we'd like to join you. But unfortunately, there was no response that they could see through their binoculars. But eventually, they wanted to organize a mass defection, but just the day before, the Austrians didn't trust the Poles very much and had spies. The Austrian management, or the senior officers, withdrew the Poles and sent them back to Poland. So that was the end of that defection. But at the end of the war, my grandfather was a member of and a co-founder of an underground officers' conspiracy known as Wolność, which translates in English as, of course, freedom. And their whole objective was to contribute to the circumstances that would lead to a rebirth of the Polish state. At the end of the war, they were responsible for some of the coups in the towns of Tarnów and Sądecki, and my grandfather was involved in the coup that wrestled control of Nowy Sącz. And he temporarily was in charge of the city and responsible for the security. And he did some unpopular things to maintain order. One of them was apparently a ban temporary on the selling of alcohol. There was a concern about pogroms and riots for a number of reasons, including the rising prices. And in order to keep things down, he undertook a number of measures. Another thing he did was invoke a rule that storekeepers had to post on their front door of their stores a complete accounting of their costs of goods and their profit margins. During the war, he was wounded twice, and he was promoted to the rank of captain. Immediately after the war, when the Polish state was recreated, there was a short-term conflict at the border with the Czechs. At one point, he describes being sent to negotiate with the Czechs, a new border line, and being blindfolded and brought by the Czechs to their headquarters to negotiate, and afterwards They negotiated in one room for several hours, came to an agreement, and in the next room there was caviar and champagne waiting. So he very much enjoyed negotiating with the Czechs. Afterwards, of course, there was a much more longer and vicious exchange with, or war with the Ukrainians. And then, of course, there was the Polish-Bolshevik War of 1919-1920. After the war, he worked as a lawyer in Warsaw in private practice, and he was active in a number of civic organizations. So in 1936, he wrote his memoirs about the war called Mknące wspomnienia z wojny 1914-1920. And Professor Julian Krzyżanowski, who's a professor of Polish literature at the University of Warsaw, and wrote this huge tome called The History of Polish Literature, describes in the section on war memoirs and reportages that my grandfather's book was the best. And as I grew up as a child, my parents repeatedly informed me that this was such a good book that I'd have to read it. The communists unfortunately banned it, of course, after the war. He didn't really have anything good to say about the Russians, either before the war, during the war, or after the war, especially the Bolshevik War. And it's not surprising that the communists would want to have that in the libraries. But it was republished in 1991 in Poland, and I subsequently found a lady through the Polish Institute in Montreal, a lady by the name of Marietta Brzeski, who kindly translated the book into English. And so on the left you see the 1936 cover of Mknące, the 1991 one, and then on the far right, a couple of years ago I published the book and made it available on Amazon. I was interviewed a couple of years ago in a local community newspaper about the book, and the person who interviewed me asked me, who translated it? And I said, oh, it's the late Marietta Brzeski. And I said so because when I met her, she was a relatively older lady, and my recollection is she told me that she had been deported to Siberia. So I assumed that she was of a generation that by now had most likely passed away. I had lost touch with her after she translated the book in 2001. But then, just recently, I discovered that she, just last year, had translated the Polish pilot Żurakowski's autobiography. So she's still very much alive. So in 1939, my grandfather was again mobilized at the rank of captain. He fought in the Rzesz nad Bugiem, was captured by the Soviets, and held as a prisoner at Starobielsk. Now, at the end of towards the end of 1939, my family, my grandmother and father received a postcard from my grandfather at Starobielsk. Which I'll get to in a second. This is the best map that I could find on the internet that really describes what happened in the Katyn Massacre. So there you see on the far right the camps of Ostashkov, Kozielsk, and Starobielsk, and the red arrows indicate where they were taken to their execution and burial sites. So for Ostashkov, they went to what was known at the time as Kwer, and now Kalinin, and buried in Mednoye. Those from Kozielsk, buried in the Katyn forest, and my grandfather taken from Starobielsk to Kharkov, and then buried in the Piaty-Hatki woods just outside of town. The green lines indicate the Poles who were anti-Soviet, kept in prisons, and as part of the operation were taken to various sites and murdered. So when in May 5th, 1940, or March 5th, I'm sorry, March 5th, Lavrenti Beria wrote to Stalin suggesting that the prisoners were all anti-Soviet and he recommended that they all be shot, he listed that there were 25,000 Poles that were at the 3 camps, in which there were 15,000, and the rest were in prisons in western Belarus and Ukraine. In the end, like I said before, in 1959, Shelepin indicated to Khrushchev that only 21,857, not the full 25,000, were murdered. We're not really sure why the discrepancy, but the green lines indicate where they were taken from and where it's believed they were mostly executed and buried. So this is the card that my grandfather sent home. And this is an interesting story. I didn't realize this until doing the research into the history of Katyn. But at one point, the NKVD allowed the prisoners at the 3 camps to write home and to get mail once a month. And it only lasted for a few months before they stopped it. The reason the NKVD did so was so that they would know the addresses of the families. And then, with that information, they engaged in a series of the midnight arrests and deportations to Kazakhstan and Siberia. I asked my father why wasn't he and his mother deported, and he told me it's because they had, in this circumstance, the relatively better fortune of living in the German zone of occupation and not the Soviet zone. By the way, I asked my father for years, what happened to a postcard? There were apparently 2. The first one, and then another one that came in February of 1940, which basically said, I have received nothing from you. So the parcels and letters that my grandmother sent were not delivered. But my father told me that these postcards, he didn't know what happened to them. They disappeared. And a couple of years ago, I had in my basement a box with files that my father had given me years ago from basically my grandmother's estate. And it contained all kinds of, government, banking records and taxes, stuff like that. And I decided to go through it to see if there's something I could triage and throw out, maybe make some more space in the basement. And I suddenly came across this old, very frail postcard. And when I looked at it, it has this hammer and sickle in the corner. And I immediately froze and wondered, what's this? And of course, the date gave it away for me, the November 30th, 1939. And so my grandfather starts off by Moja Żabciu, in a loving term. And there's one line where he actually says he's hopeful that they will be released soon. So a couple of years ago, I became absolutely fed up of hearing about Katyn in little drips and drabs. The story was one that was full of uncertainty, of course, before 1990. And then afterwards, when the archives were open and the cemeteries were open and so on, there were a series of pieces of information that came out in the media that helped to resolve what happened to the missing bodies of the prisoners from Ostashkov and Starobielsk. But I wanted to finally get it, because after so many years I was hopeful that the file had now been closed, we knew the answers, it was such a painful matter that hopefully we could put it in a box and be happy. But I eventually got up to a point where I wanted to know the full story. And so I began collecting as many books as I could in English that told the story of Katyn. And in the process, I realized what an absolutely phenomenal, fascinating history this is, that's tied in not just with the officers who were killed, but also with the deportations to Kazakhstan and Siberia and so on. And so I decided to write this book that provides a summary and an annotation of what I consider to be the most important books, 38 books by 32 different authors from before 1990 and after 1990 that tell the story of Katyn. And I would just highlight that one of the authors that I consider absolutely phenomenal is Joseph Kawczak. He was at Starobielsk and was among the 400 prisoners that the Soviets did not kill but sent to Gryozyovets, and who were able to survive and then join the Anders army in 42 or 41. And he wrote in 1944 Wspomnienia Starobielsk, right? Memories of Starobielsk, which was just printed recently in English for the first time. It was also printed and published in the past in French. But he also wrote a book in 1951 that was published in English that's absolutely phenomenal, and once again has been just republished recently in the States, and it's called Na nieludzkiej ziemi, the Inhuman Land, which is a phenomenal title and an absolutely phenomenal book about how he was assigned the task by Anders to search for the missing officers, which is, by the way, a task that he also had at the end of the Polish-Bolshevik War. He didn't find any of the missing Polish officers in 1920, and of course he didn't find any in 1941 or 42. Then, the other book I wrote about Katyn grandson and No Permission to Forget. Here in Canada, we've for years been hearing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Royal Commission regarding the residential schools of the Indigenous people. And part of that media coverage is talking about intragenerational or transgenerational transfer of trauma. And I also went many times over the past couple of years to a number of Holocaust Remembrance Day events organized by the Jewish community here in Ottawa. And many of their speakers were introduced as second or third generation Holocaust survivors, meaning that they were the children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And I realized that when my father told me that I would never meet my grandfather because the Russians killed him at Katyn, and he told me about how he grew up with a sick mother with no father because of Katyn, I felt his pain. His pain was my pain. And there was also a transgenerational, intergenerational transfer of trauma. And so, a couple of years ago, one of the Polish politicians who went to Katyn at a commemorative event gave a speech which was summarized in the media, in which he used the expression, "We are not permitted to forget." And I thought that was just such a beautiful sentence that I used it as a subtitle for my book. And before we get to this short video about my grandfather, I just want to say one thing about the issue of why is it important, I think, to remember Katyn. And I think in the program and the posters about this event, it indicated that I was going to make a statement. So here's my statement. I think there are several reasons why we need to remember Katyn. Obviously, for those of us who have relatives, it behooves us to remember their memory. But there's something else. I think, first of all, Katyn really exposes just how much communism dehumanizes people. Because Lenin said that you have to break an egg to make an omelet. And that expression was generally speaking understood to mean that the ends justify the means. So what were the ends? To just subjugate Poland. And what were the means? Mass murder. There were no limits to the Kremlin about what could be done to achieve their objectives. And this is dehumanizing. And the other thing is, I think it behooves us to study Katyn and to know the history of Katyn because it helps us to understand today. The lessons of Katyn, of how the Kremlin managed in phases to carry out this horrific crime, I think helps us to analyze and assess current events. And just at the end of last year, the Prime Minister of Finland made a speech at the EU where she was quoted as saying, "We should have listened to Poland." And of course, I think everybody should listen to Poland. But there's nothing special that, for example, the Lithuanians couldn't tell the Finns. And of course, the Finns had their own experience with Russia. Oh, I'm sorry.
We're both.
Yeah. And so, the thing is that when the Finnish prime ministers were said to, that we should listen to the Poles, I don't think the Poles have any particular unique skill of clairvoyance. What I think she should have said is, we should have studied Katyn. Because if you study Katyn, you can assess today. And when you see events like Bucha, you see that things haven't, in the Kremlin's behavior and modus operandi, evolved very much. And so when you can make that kind of assessment, it's also possible, when you study Katyn, to make predictions. We can say what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen after tomorrow. But based on history and recent events, I can say with certainty, unfortunately, that I believe there will be more lies, mass murder, and cover-up. And I pray that the day after tomorrow, the Kremlin will begin to appreciate human life and human rights. Thank you.